We have Natalie Sexton, Danielle Ross Winslow, Dr. Myron Floyd, Eric Thompson, and Brad Milley, and I will turn it over to Natalie.
All right, thanks guys. So who's as excited as me to be talking about science and research right before Beer 30? Woo! Right. Thank you for that feigned enthusiasm. Actually, I think you guys are going to enjoy this session. And I'm really excited about this collaboration with research because I think it gets to some of the points that Iantha was making about when you're working collaboratively with a shared vision, you can just accomplish so much more. I had the fortune of being involved even when I was at USGS when this initiative first kicked off. And one of the things that's so cool about this initiative is even from the very beginning, there was a real emphasis on trying to really understand what the science was telling us, what information we could draw from to inform this process. Folks did interviews early on with partners and staff, worked really hard and systematically on the standards of excellence. And because there was this understanding that one of the critical pieces of all of this is to try to get a better baseline understanding of what we know about understanding diverse audiences and what is working, where we're meeting barriers, whether that's internally or externally, and how we can do a better job to be more strategic. And that's really what this research effort's about. So the Natural Resource Program Center, where I'm located, sponsored this research in collaboration with NC State and with USGS. So why now? I'll go through this pretty quickly. Jim Kurth did an excellent job of talking about it's really about relevancy, and other folks have talked about this too. It's connecting, not only doing our work to ensure that we're doing efficient and effective conservation at a more landscape scale, but being more relevant with ever-changing American public, and having that continued conservation ethic, ensuring sustainability, providing those wildlife-dependent recreation opportunities, which then steps down into political, financial, and advocacy support. And really what we're trying to do is, over time, create a citizenry that cares about wildlife and cares about conservation and is really poised to solve those environmental problems in the future. So we're using science, social science, to inform urban initiative efforts. And really the underlying question, kind of the big picture question, is what factors facilitate or inhibit being able to connect urban audiences with wildlife and nature? And that's the barriers, so what barriers exist, and what are some of the strategies that actually work. So our approach is a three-pronged approach, really. First is, what is our state of current understanding from the literature? There's a lot of literature out there about recreation with diverse audiences and urbanization. And we look to North Carolina State University to look at the literature, summarize that literature in a way that could be useful for practitioners to better understand the barriers and the motivations and some strategies that other researchers have found. And Eric Thompson and Dr. Myron Floyd from NC State, the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management, will be talking about that in their work, what they've learned from that literature review. Our second approach is what's working on the ground, talking to you all, talking to our partners. What are we already doing successfully? How can we learn from that? Where are we getting stuck, as Iantha said, and why is that? And we have been leading that research. Danielle Ross Winslow has been interviewing staff and partners at several refuges, and that's ongoing still, and she'll be speaking to that. And lastly, actually going to some communities across the country. We're meeting with community leaders in communities adjacent to 6 refuges across the country. And both USGS and NC State are leading that work, where they're meeting with community leaders to find out what are some motivations for engaging in recreation, and what are they looking for, what are some unmet needs, and where, hopefully from that, we can identify where is some overlap between what refuges can provide and what folks in those communities are looking for. And I think I said NC State and USGS are leading that work. And we've completed one of those, and that was what Brad Milley will talk about. That was done at the Arsenal just this week, actually. So I'll turn it over to Eric to talk about the literature review.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks to you all for listening to me this afternoon. So yeah, over the next few minutes, I'll be sharing with you, and Dr. Floyd will be sharing with you, what we have found so far in our review of the scientific literature. And we will start with rationale for this literature review. Why are we doing this? As well as our approach. How are we reading through this literature? And we'll present to you this set of preliminary findings that we found from our first pass through, with a focus on the management implications as recommended by the author, and then kind of a synthesis of those. That'll be Dr. Floyd speaking to that. So to start off, why this literature review? The purpose is to review what has been written in the social science literature that connects urban and diverse audiences with wildlife-dependent recreation, bringing all those together so as to use the best available evidence to inform management, as well as promote an exchange between researchers and managers, as Natalie discussed, as well as to fill a gap. To the best of our knowledge, a review of this has not been done, of the literature that relates urban audiences and wildlife-dependent recreation. So our methods, we used searches in online databases such as EBSCOhost and Google Scholar, just big conglomerations of documents, looking for keywords such as hunt, fish, wildlife watch, urban, metro, race, ethnicity, Latino, African American, so on. And to be included in our study, a paper had to meet 4 criteria. First off, had to examine wildlife-dependent recreation, and we focused on hunting, fishing, and wildlife watching for this first pass through the literature. It had to look at urban populations or minority populations, or if studies were of a general population, they had to make comparisons between racial and ethnic groups. We were looking for studies that had an empirical analysis, so analyzing the data and reporting from that, and we looked at papers that had been published since 1999. And with all that in place, we found 54 articles that applied to this literature review. So 35 of these came from peer-reviewed literature, scientific journals. The 2 main contributors to that were Human Dimensions of Wildlife and Leisure Sciences. And we found 19 papers from non-peer-reviewed sources. So that's like the Northeastern Recreational Research Symposium, articles from that, so conference proceedings, dissertations, or government reports. And so to talk a little bit about what we did with that, we analyzed this looking at the methods they used. So how did they get their data? On-site surveys, telephone surveys, mail surveys, focus groups, so on and so forth. Looking at the topic of their research, what were they studying, as well as the implications for management and for research that were recommended by the authors. And currently in process, we're doing a reliability analysis, which is where we're having a second researcher come in and independently go through all this information to ensure consistency and make sure that it matches up. So what did we find? Just kind of a quick rundown. Most of the studies that we found were quantitative surveys, so taking numbers to make demographic comparisons, comparing groups and their participation in recreation activities, as well as the psychological elements that are related to that participation. So motivations, preferences, satisfaction, perceived benefits, that kind of thing. What we saw was that fishing was the most studied activity by far, followed by wildlife watching and then hunting. The people who were studied, the groups that they actually looked at and talked to, were mostly license holders, fishing and hunting license holders, people who were on-site engaged in recreation activities that people came up and talked to, and just surveys of the general public. And the recommendations that the authors supplied, most of them directed managers to target specific groups for further understanding and outreach. And Dr. Floyd is going to talk about that in detail in a little bit. So looking at who was studied, like I said, you can see there that general population, license holders, and recreation participants were the main ones. There were 5 studies that looked specifically at urban populations. That was where they drew their sample from. You had a few other categories as well, youth and subject experts. And then looking more at who was studied, looking at the racial and ethnic groups that were studied throughout these 54 articles. We saw 23 papers that was their main topic. They were specifically looking at racial and ethnic groups. You can see that of those 23 papers, 13 were making comparisons across groups. Of the papers that only looked at one group in particular, you can see that Latinos were the most studied group, and followed by African Americans, Asians, and Native Americans. And then the last thing I'll talk about is where these studies took place. So breaking it down by Fish and Wildlife Service regions, you can see the numbers represent how many studies were conducted in that region. You can see, Region 2, Region 3, and Region 5 were definitely the areas that had the most research done. What's not shown on this map are studies that compared across regions, so looking and comparing one part of the country to another part of the country. We saw 9 of those, and 5 studies just looked at the general U.S. as a whole, and 3 studies came from outside the U.S. So that lets you know kind of where this information came from and how we got it, and I will pass it over to Dr. Myron Floyd.
Thanks, Eric. My job is to talk now about some of the findings that have come out of this literature review. And I just want to remind everyone that we made one pass through the literature so far. We've identified studies that focus on wildlife-dependent recreations primarily. And that in that, we looked at studies that come from a variety of different geographical regions, as Eric pointed out, and they also come from different public land management settings. For example, U.S. Forest Service areas, national park settings, and also, as well as urban park settings. We have what we call a lot of heterogeneity in the data, and which makes it somewhat difficult to draw conclusions, but we do try to attempt to synthesize that information in a way that we can better understand it and use it for our needs. And what I'd like to do is summarize it in terms of the 3 areas that we're focusing on in our focus group to understand what are the motivations behind wildlife-dependent recreation among diverse audiences, what are the barriers and constraints, and then what are the management strategies, particularly those strategies, as Eric pointed out, that have been identified in the literature. And that's somewhat of a disclaimer because these are not my recommendations. These are what the authors in the studies have recommended. So first, in terms of motivation, as we find in the literature overall, that participation is motivated by a mix of desired benefits. And what I want to do is point out some things that tend to be first associated with urban audiences, regardless of the groups involved in those. So for example, some of the things that we saw, and these are just highlights of some of the findings, is that even in urban parks, that wildlife viewing, the opportunity to see animals and birds is an important aspect of the urban park experience, as well as having convenience for on-site fishing experiences. In some cases, non-consumptive wildlife uses tends to be something that's favored among urban audiences versus activities like hunting and fishing, which is more popular or which might be more valued in rural audiences. And also add to that, among some of the research about urban audiences, there's less direct experience with wildlife-related problems. For example, you don't have the problem of crop damage from deer or other wildlife in urban settings. You have other issues. But there are just certain wildlife issues that are not common in urban settings that you'd find in rural settings. So one key issue here is having convenient and accessible facilities. Now looking at specific findings related to different ethnic groups. And as Eric mentioned, the majority of the studies focused on fishing, and so I'm going to focus primarily here on what are the motivations associated with recreational fishing. First, among Latino anglers, we see that achievement, and I should say this is compared to the majority group, we see there's more emphasis on achievement, consumption, that's catching and consuming, skill development, the natural environment, as we heard earlier, that there's been some literature that might suggest that minority groups, and particularly Latinos and African Americans, are not that concerned about the environment, but what we see in these measures that measure, the items that measure what the importance placed on the environment, that Latinos in some cases place more importance on that than majority groups. And as we've seen across the literature and across different settings, that family and social benefits is a very strong driver of recreation participation among Latinos, and in this case, among Latino anglers. One of the distinction characteristics among Black anglers is this emphasis on catch, and there are other things there like accessibility, which is characteristic of urban audiences overall, and on-site amenities. But among Black anglers, there seems to be a very strong emphasis and importance placed on catch. That relates to not only just catching fish, but also catching fish of a certain size, larger fish, higher quantities of fish, and keeping them and consuming them, and eating them, of course. And this poses a significant risk where we have issues with contaminated or polluted waters and such that, again, I'll come back to that in a moment, but it raises some issues about information, risk communication, and how that information should be provided. Another issue here, another finding, is that their social groups tends to differ. There's research that shows that, particularly among Black males, there tends to be a little bit more solo and individual experiences as compared to some more social experiences among some other groups. And again, I put out the disclaimer that this is just some highlights from the literature, and I'm not generalizing across the board, but these are some of the things that we are finding in the literature. So in terms of constraints, what are some of the barriers? One of the most mentioned reasons or barriers of constraints to recreation participation is lack of time. You find that across a number of different activities across all population groups. And so time, things like lack of a partner for doing an activity, that tends to be a common type of recreation constraint. But some of the constraints that tend to be associated with minority audiences that we found in the literature relate to perceived discrimination or actual discrimination experiences, or being hassled by other recreationists. In some cases, in a study reported by Bingston and others, instances of where Hmong residents felt that they were being hassled by law enforcement rather than other outdoor recreationists. So that's something that tends to show up in the literature associated with minority groups. Some of the Forest Service research shows that in the Pacific Northwest, that some Asian families fear for their safety and the safety of their children, and that limits the extent to which they allow their children to go far beyond where they are. So these are some of the concerns that we see, again, among U.S. Forest Service, areas where the U.S. Forest Service provides outdoor recreation. Also, there's information as a constraint in three respects. One is information in terms of knowing where to recreate, what kinds of things you can do. Information in terms of being knowledgeable of risk and hazards associated with an outdoor recreation setting, as related to fishing, for example. And also information related to public land policies, knowing that a national park is different from a national forest is different from a wildlife refuge, and all are different from an urban city or community park. And so there seems not to be information available or the knowledge there where they can discriminate between what can be done in these different areas. So as I mentioned, that there are a number of management recommendations that have been made in the literature, and I'm not going to try to summarize all of them, but I am going to try to synthesize some of the key points that were made. First off, with the idea, or with the finding that fishing was the most studied activity, one set of papers recommended that fishing be kind of an activity that can hook youth and other population subgroups to use fishing to introduce them to other recreation programming, other conservation education programming. Secondly, as was mentioned earlier, trust and credibility is key, particularly in those areas in situations where there's been historical or his institutional discrimination, which is common in tribal areas, in many places across the South, and in situations where there's been just poor relations between public land agencies and local communities. So that would be important to address past discrimination and also to communicate risk information. Are you a credible source? And I think that's what the authors are trying to get across, where some people would take information from word of mouth, from a family member, rather than a written communication from a land management agency. And then three, in order for relationships and partnerships to be sustained, it is important that credibility and trust be established. For the long-term relationships, they tend to break down in the short term if these are not established. Also, as was mentioned earlier, diverse publics require diverse strategies, and I'm just going to sum it up by saying use the Coca-Cola strategy, I think that's what the authors were intended there, not treating everyone as the same. One shoe does not fit all. That's another way of saying that. And I think we've already said this as well, is that we must involve, at least the authors were saying, and I agree, that we must involve the lay public in planning and decision making. As we've just had a discussion about the kind of the two-way mirror, as it were, or the two-way communication, not coming in with the agenda, but allowing that agenda to be set with a community that we are working with, or that you are working with. So finally, across all of these studies, we've seen this emphasis on partnerships. We've heard it a lot this afternoon. And I think it's very important, it's very key, as I said before, that partnerships that are built on equal footing, built on equity, built on this mutual understanding are those that will tend to be sustained, and those that will last, and those that will be most effective. And I think the quote here from one of the papers that we saw that kind of, it's from the environmental education situation, but I think it can apply to a number of situations that we are involved in as we engage in this work. But this idea is that we should partner with communities rather than trying to do things for communities. So again, in terms of summary and what we're trying to do, as Natalie pointed out, we are fitting our literature review with the data that comes in from the focus groups that we're conducting around the country. We are also applying the data that will be coming from the manager interviews that you will hear more about, and we're hoping there's a sweet spot there, a sweet spot where we will have knowledge-based information, evidence-based information coming from the literature, evidence coming from the focus groups, and evidence coming from the manager interviews in order to build this body of knowledge or knowledge base from which we can reach out to diverse audiences to make these opportunities available to all Americans. Thank you.
We have time for one or two questions, if there are any, for Eric and Myron.
Yes, Dr. Floyd, in your meta-analysis, you talked about hunting, fishing, and wildlife observation, but you didn't consider people doing environmental education or going to an interpretive site as part of a recreational use?
I would, you could correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think we did include those things if they involve some aspect of wildlife-dependent recreation. For example, I cited a study about urban park users and the importance they placed on seeing animals and birds and so forth. So in that paper, it dealt with urban parks and use of urban parks, but when you look at the data tables, it did include importance placed on those three items. So in addition to facilities and other types of park facilities.
Users using a nature trail, for example, were not excluded from the meta-analysis?
Use of a nature trail by itself would not be included.
Right. If the article also made specific mention to wildlife watching while on the nature trail, it would be included. Yes.
Yeah. And I also say at this point, it's not a meta-analysis. It's just a review of the literature and synthesis.
We've got one more, and then we will have time at the end for those that are still with us before 5:30 to have some more questions.
I'm sorry, as you can tell, I was the kid that sat at the front of the class. One of the things that we've sort of been learning out of External Affairs Office of Partner Liaison is, I don't know if you would call it an urban myth, but sort of community-driven misinformation about either national parks or refuges or even creeks, just natural bodies of water by both African American and Hispanic communities. On the Hispanic community, it is far more common to believe someone's neighbor or a community member, don't put your feet in there, that's just sewage water. You know, don't go near those park facilities, that's, you know, XYZ. There's a somewhat of an urban myth in the African American community about national parks, and I know we're refuges, so I always say yuck, 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 yuck when I hear it. But the sort of like the belief is that most serial killers or killings happen at national parks. And that, right. So, you know, it's some of those like urban community sort of misinformation that travels along, and the professor mentioned it. It's more common to believe someone you trust or a community member than information from the government in these particular cases. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that.
Other than that's what some of the literature shows, and those findings relate to fishing and warnings that either regulatory agencies or fisheries managers were putting on their information and who they would believe, and it's more common among Hispanic and African Americans. It feels that way. But you know, the one thing I'll point out, if I might, is that we've only identified 54 studies, and it's a small body. It's a small slice of the overall literature, and we've done other reviews of the general literature on a broader topic, and there's really not a whole lot on this topic out there. And when Eric said that, you know, no review like this exists, it's exactly right. I mean, we've searched, and it was hard for us to find. Did we ever find one study on a national wildlife refuge in the literature? I mean, there have been data collected, but have those data been written up and published in a peer-reviewed or a research-oriented or scientific journal? So it's a real need to further explore those kinds of things.
Okay, I think we'll move along, and thanks for being so engaged. Next up is Danielle Ross Winslow, and she's been, there's been lots and lots of interviews happening the last few weeks, and she's going to tell us what she's hearing from folks like yourself in the field. Maybe she's even talked to some of y'all out there. So.
Well, thank you. As Natalie said, I'll be providing the overview of the interviews with refuge staff and partner organization representatives. There we go. And to start, I want to briefly touch on some key points from the literature. Most of the research regarding visitation has come from the perspective of program participants. And I think Eric and Myron just did a great job of providing an overview of that literature. But few studies have really looked at issues affecting visitation and engagement from the organizational perspective. And there is a recognition that more information is needed from those who interact with visitors, those who are on the ground trying to engage with diverse and non-traditional audiences, and those that are in leadership positions, like you all. And the few studies that have focused on organizational aspects have generally looked at workforce diversity as a means of natural resource agencies to be more inclusive, and also at organizational culture. And by organizational culture, I mean the shared values, beliefs, symbols, and attitudes within an organization, and a shared vision of what the organization should be. So by a show of hands, who here would say that the refuge systems culture is strong? It's a lot. I think most. Anyone would say it was weak? Yeah. So I think we have mostly people feeling it's a strong culture. So that can be a blessing and a curse. So strong organizational culture is good. It builds cohesiveness and commitment and loyalty. But when an organizational culture is strong, it can be difficult to change within the organization. And research has suggested that natural resource and recreational agencies often unknowingly create and maintain barriers that inhibit the perceived program accessibility or attractiveness to ethnic minorities. And I think it's one of the greatest challenges of any organization to identify the types of barriers and biases that do exist in program delivery and in organizational policies and practices. So our study purpose was to better understand the process of engaging urban audiences in wildlife-dependent recreation. And the following research questions are guiding the study. We're looking at who is and isn't visiting from the perspective of practitioners and why they do or don't visit. Also at what strategies are successful for engaging the urban audiences. Like Ayantha was just asking the group, and I think I should recruit her to do interviews with me. You're very good at that, getting that information out. And then also how the culture within the refuge system and service influences engagement by urban audiences. And we're using a qualitative approach for the study to allow for a deeper understanding of the complexities that can be beyond the reach of more traditional quantitative methods. And that looks like in-depth, semi-structured telephone interviews. And they're semi-structures. I've found in doing these already that it's really necessary to be flexible. Everyone has such unique experiences and perspectives and comes from different urban settings, and the urban refuges are so different that it's really necessary to kind of just be flexible in that interview with the questions. And thus far, I've conducted 12 interviews with refuge staff, and that includes refuge managers, project leaders, visitor service staff, interpretation specialists, and law enforcement. And they've ranged from about a half an hour to an hour in length. The interviews have been recorded, and they will be transcribed. And I just want to express my appreciation for those who have participated and those who hopefully will participate in the future, because I think it can be really hard. From some researchers have suggested that one of the reasons that there isn't more literature studies in this area is because agencies don't want to be exposed as having subpar diversity management programs or discriminatory organizational culture. So it's hard to kind of look internally and maybe criticize yourself, but I think it's an extremely important thing to do, and also to examine those successes. So I want to share with you all some of the things that I'm hearing, with the caveat that I don't intend to present these as results, because we haven't completed data collection and we haven't fully analyzed the data that we do have. And it's also not comprehensive. There are just a few things that have stood out thus far. So one of the things that's been coming up a lot for a reason why urban residents don't visit the refuge is visibility, awareness, knowledge of the refuge. And staff recalls hearing statements such as, "I've lived here for 30 years and never knew you existed," or, "Oh, I thought this was a national park." So saying that even if people are there and they are engaging, that maybe they're not engaging or connecting with them in a way that lets them know that it's a refuge and what the refuge is about. And echoing what Jim brought up earlier about marketing, one of the suggested contributing factors to the lack of visibility was that as a federal agency, they don't have funds to do marketing. Others were that in areas where there's a lot of outdoor recreation options, that there's a lot of competition for visitors, and that's seen as a challenge, as well as competition for newspaper space where they put out information about special events that may be hosted. You're competing with a host of other organizations that offer things. And then also that there's an unwillingness to be innovative with marketing and to try new things within the refuge system. And there is a sense that refuges tend to default to stale-looking websites and newsletters, and if they would try more modern and interesting ways to communicate that, it would help with visibility. I'm sorry. We have also heard some things related to cultural barriers within the organization that have come up, and the belief that there are strong cultural barriers within refuges and that they're stronger than ever. And these quotes are examples of this. And here, once again, a resistance to trying new things came up. And a few others that have stood out are the need to prioritize. And so that was suggesting that at the leadership level that need to make this a priority or prioritize things. Because as one person said, if you're going to do new things, you have to give up old things. Another was the importance of getting off-site to reach more diverse audiences that won't likely come to the refuge on their own. That's come up, and what's also come up with that is the challenges with funding and staffing that go along with that, go along with having these off-site programs. A lot of people have really recognized Friends Group and other partnerships that help the refuge accomplish their goals and reach new audiences. And again, there's some challenges associated with that. One of the challenges that someone articulated was that the people in coordination positions within a lot of these groups that they want to build partnerships with, it's not very continuous, so they change from season to season or from year to year, so it's hard to have some continuity in those partnerships. And lastly, it's come up that sometimes the staff feels as though they're working in isolation and not hearing about what's going on at other urban refuges and what they're doing, and they're also not sharing their stories about what they're doing. So I think this is an excellent thing to have here, the Urban Academy, where we're doing that, and hopefully it inspires everyone to continue doing that. There have been a lot of other great insights as well. So I look forward to continuing with the project and sharing those. Moving forward, we'll be doing additional interviews, including those with the partners from organizations and the data analysis as well. And then, as Myron had touched on too, the integrating with other components of the project, of the research project, so really looking at the big picture and seeing how what we learn in the interviews compares to what we learn in the focus groups and as well to the literature. I think it's particularly interesting because a lot of the literature, like what I touched on earlier, was drawn from MPS studies of MPS staff, so not so much refuge staff, so I think it'll be an interesting comparison to see what that looks like. So, yep. I'm just going to end with this quote and I'd just like to tell you all that I've been really excited to work on the project and this component in particular because I do believe that it's a really important piece that will help to identify future strategies that can make the visitor experience more inclusive and integrate those individuals who have traditionally been underrepresented as visitors. And I really like this quote. I think someone on the Urban Initiative team actually shared this. It's from a blog post by Mickey Fernan, who was the former National Park Service Deputy Director. And I like the part about until we learn how to reach all Americans. And I don't think that's an easy task, and it's increasingly challenging to understand and respond to the needs and interests of diverse groups. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Does anybody have a question or comment to share on Danielle's presentation? She was so thorough that nobody has a question. All right. That was excellent. Thank you. Okay, next is Brad Milley from, I didn't say before, the Policy Analysis and Science Assistance Branch at the Fort Collins Science Center in, with USGS.
Thanks, Natalie. Before we start, I just want to let everyone know that I'm the only thing standing between you and dinner and beer. So I expect a really engaged audience, a lot of head nodding, laugh at all my jokes, and we'll get out of here without any trouble. Otherwise, it might be a while. So I'm going to talk about the Urban Refuge Focus Group effort that Natalie mentioned in her introduction. And as Natalie said, we've so far conducted a focus group with the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, so I want to let you know that these are really preliminary results. There we go. So I'm not going to beat a dead horse and tell you all why we need to talk to partners in the field and why we need to engage underserved audiences. I think leading up to my presentation right now, we've had a lot of really interesting demographic analysis, a lot of social justice issues that have been brought to light about why it's important to engage the breadth and diversity of the American people. You know, I will say that the National Visitor Survey did a really good job of sort of not only showing us who comes to National Wildlife Refuges, but also who's not coming. And those people who are not coming, you know, are the people who we've been talking about all day. Diverse audiences, urban residents, socioeconomically disadvantaged people, and really just people living in urban areas in general. So the focus group effort, as you know, we all know, is a partnership between the three agencies. And we've so far conducted only one focus group out of 12 planned at 6 different refuges. So again, preliminary results. But we did have a focus group at Rocky Mountain Arsenal last week. And I'd like to thank the Arsenal staff for facilitating that meeting, or not facilitating, but for giving us the resources needed to help with that meeting. Because as some of you may know, the Rocky Mountain Arsenal is currently closed to the public because of the flooding in Colorado. So we were actually still able to carry out the focus group. We had a few participants drop out, but we still had a really robust discussion. Speaking of participants, we had 7 people. We had mayor, we had leaders of youth corps, we had members of parks and open space committees, and we had several concerned citizens. So we had a really diverse group of people. One of the first things we talked about is what is outdoor recreation. And we asked people to list outdoor recreation and the types that they're familiar with. And some of the things that came up are things that the Fish and Wildlife Service is very familiar with. Fishing, hiking, hunting, bird watching, things like that. Those came up very quickly on top of people's mind. But we also dove in a little bit about things that the Fish and Wildlife Service maybe knows about that we're familiar with, but we might not do. And some of the words I'm about to say may be 4-letter words to some of you in the audience, so I just want to sort of prepare you. I'm going to say things like four-wheeling and running and picnicking. And some of those I've heard can be a little controversial depending on which region you're in. Those things certainly came up as other forms of outdoor recreation. We also talked about highly individual nature-based or activities, as well as group sports. A lot of people mention things such as basketball and golf as an outdoor recreation opportunity. So without giving you a laundry list of activities that people put forth, I just want to let you know that some of what came up is what we really don't expect. So does yoga in the park constitute a wildlife-dependent activity? That's something to ponder, because these are the sorts of outdoor recreation that people who live in urban areas think about and desire. So they really have diverse views of outdoor recreation. So we moved into talking about why people recreate in nature. Again and again and again, people said it's healthy. It's a healthy activity. And at least anecdotally to me, it seems as though that's becoming a more and more common theme when people talk about why they participate in forms of recreation in general. And it certainly came up in this focus group. It's also fun. People don't go to wildlife refuges generally to engage in purely scientific or purely educational activities. They may go for those, but they're going because it's fun. I mean, if it's not fun, why do it? That's why they're there. It's also an escape. It's an escape from city life. It's an escape from the hustle and bustle of the city, noise, all those kinds of things. As one individual put it, it's also an escape from their family. That was then followed up by a mother of 4 who said it's also a great way to spend time with your family. It's cheap. We may be talking about economically disadvantaged populations where even a small fee may constitute a large barrier to participation. Outdoor recreation is often seen as a cheap alternative. Not always the case, but often is. Finally, it's different, it's strange, it's unique, it's exotic. We may not think of outdoor recreation as difficult or exotic or unique, but a lot of people who live in urban areas do. Just by a show of hands, who in here grew up sort of connected to nature, be it because you lived adjacent to some undeveloped land, or your parents took you on hikes, or you lived on a farm, something like that? Who in this room? Okay, thank you. Now who didn't grow up in that sort of thing? Okay, so looking around, from what we know about the American population, that should tell us something, because we're not really mirroring the experiences of the American population. So just something to keep in mind when we think about reaching out to different audiences. Lastly, along with this recreation, is urban wildlife refuges are sort of seen as a transition zone. We have what we're comfortable with, which may be an urban environment. We have something that would make us panic, which may be like a wilderness area. But then we have some areas in between. We have urban wildlife refuges. Maybe you still get cell phone coverage. Maybe you can still see the city like you can at Rocky Mountain Arsenal. Maybe you didn't have to drive very far. Maybe you got off the bus and came to the refuge. And as one person put it, maybe they'll still find your body. So it's sort of in that stretch zone in terms of outdoor recreation. You're doing really well with the laughter, by the way, so we should wrap up pretty quickly here. Next, really the most important take home from what I'm talking about is when we ask people what they want refuges to play a role in their lives. I mean, take that statement and bold it, underline it, add exclamation points. I would have done all of that, but it would have looked ugly. I mean, that is the key take home. Whenever we talk to people at these focus groups, and whenever you're looking, you speak to people in your day-to-day lives, they're interested in the refuge. They just want it to be there for them. So what gets in the way? We know a lot of things get in the way. We know fear gets in the way, fear of the unknown. If I grew up in an urban area, which I sort of did, but I grew up with folks who took me out into nature. But if I grew up in an urban area and was never exposed to nature, hiking might be terrifying to me. I may not know what to wear, what to bring, all those kinds of things. There's also loneliness. One respondent put it, I don't want to be the only black person on the refuge. Money, as I mentioned before, small fees can present a big barrier. Access is really important, accessibility. Can you get to the refuge without a car? If you have a car, is it convenient to get to the refuge? Is it really quick? And is the access equitable to all people? That can be a big issue where access is sort of funneled through one channel and may not be accessible to all people. There's also the feeling of being unwelcome was brought up. One of the participants said that you can tell in the first half second of talking to someone whether or not they welcome your presence at a refuge. So that's something to keep in mind when you're talking to people. We talked about ways to increase participation. Biggest thing that was hit home was tell us that the refuge is here. We don't even know what that piece of land is. Tell us it's a wildlife refuge. Tell us it's open to the public. Welcome us in. Is the Blue Goose sign on a post enough? Probably not. What about a billboard that says, this is your National Wildlife Refuge, welcome, come and see what we have to offer? We also know from Myron and Eric and others that people don't know the difference between many land management organizations. Within our focus group itself, people referred to Rocky Mountain Arsenal in about 12 different ways. People asked us who managed the refuge, and these are engaged citizens. Also get them to volunteer, something we all know. And you may say, yeah, that's great, but how do you get people to volunteer? Well, they said, tell us what you need done specifically and ask us to come do it. We need a bridge built. Can you help? And finally, partnerships and networking. You can do a lot more than you can with limited staff if you simply invite your partners or go out and seek partners who already have networks set up. Does a wildlife refuge necessarily need to teach a birding class, or can it open the door and let someone else teach a class on its property? So where do we go from here? We're going to be doing focus groups at 6 wildlife refuges across the country in partnership with NC State. So far we've touched on Rocky Mountain Arsenal. USGS is also going to work on Tualatin River. We'll go San Francisco Bay, Minnesota Valley, John Hines, and Loxahatchee. And finally, I'd like to wrap up with 2 back-to-back quotes from our focus group. This is a different kind of refuge. The usual strategy is to take a piece of natural land and cordon it off as a refuge. Here they are trying to create prairie in an urban area that was a Superfund site. Think of the unique aspects of this refuge. It should be run differently. And then the next person said, it's a great experiment. Come share the excitement. That should be the message. So I hope you'll join us in sharing the excitement about moving forward with urban refuges. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Questions for Brad? Michael?
Thanks. This is for Brad, but also Eric, you mentioned it too. I was wondering if there's anything about youth that you can pull out of your kind of general, I know there were like 6 youth studies and you mentioned youth corps.
Yes.
I guess I'm curious, do any of what the information that you provided in the overview change when you specifically talk about young people?
Yeah, I can speak to that first. I actually forgot that part of my talk, so thank you. People said, teach children, and that's a really common theme, teach children, but what does that mean? They said, teach the children because the children will teach their parents, was a theme that came up. So you have to sort of, think like a river. Think whatever you do upstream affects downstream when you're teaching children. What message do you want children to bring back to their parents? Was something that came up in the focus groups related to children.
In regards to the literature, some of the recommendations that came up are, especially for teenagers, provide social opportunities. And you can keep that in mind with partnering with the community organizations, partnering with schools, that sort of thing. Some recommendations as well, I read, embracing the technology that pervade kids' lives, and providing them opportunity to use electronics in the outdoors so that it doesn't become competition. That was another thing that came up a couple times.
Just tackle him, Maggie.
Yeah.
I just have a question about your study areas are in truly urban areas, and so some of us are not quite so urban, maybe suburban or mixed. So at the risk of generalizing what you learned from your survey work and the interviews, I'll be wondering, as we go through the week, how much of that is applicable to our own area? Do we not want to overgeneralize? Or is it just a starting point for us to take that and then kind of find out what's true for our own area?
Yes, it's a starting point. We also don't want to overgeneralize, and we did pick truly urban areas. You're absolutely correct. But I think what's key is that we're talking about people who are disconnected from nature, and those types of people don't just live in urban areas. So I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of overlap, but like you said, it's a start, and we're starting on the urban end of the spectrum.
And I will say, we spent a good bit of time trying to decide, okay, do we kind of go to some of these areas where we don't have refuges or some of these more fringe urban? And, eventually we only can go so many places, but we said we really should go to these where we really should be knocking it out of the park and be able to learn, in these really obviously urban areas where we can learn the most, and then hopefully that has application to other areas as well. So in case you're concerned that we're doing all this great research and then this is all you're going to ever hear about it, we have lots of plans to get it out there, and those of you that know me, I'll be like shouting it off from the rooftops and doing broadcasts and podcasts and all that other stuff. But we've got several things planned. One is with the literature review, really trying to not only get that, but the tools and resources that this whole team is aware of, getting those made available, having a report summarizing the literature review, included in annotated bibliography so you can see summaries of those articles. With the work that Danielle's doing, identifying and sharing with leadership what has been identified as some of those internal barriers. And then, identifying these strategies for engagement, not only from other researchers, but from those of you like you in the room, as well as the communities that we aim to serve. So again, kind of this three-pronged approach. And then one thing that I'm really excited about is that the focus group effort and that whole process will be written up, I think can really serve as a model process. So, we are taking a research methodology in providing that. But the basic premise of that is a two-way dialogue, talking with community leaders, hearing what needs are, hearing where their values are, finding out where you can have some common ground, like someone else had said earlier. And then all of this information will be connected to the Urban Refuge Handbook or a web-based toolkit where all of these resources and outcomes from this initiative will be provided. So we have time for a few more questions. It's 5 till or 25 after. If anyone has any parting questions for the panel.
I just want to know timeline. How long is this going to take? When do you think you'll publish?
Well,
I just was asking about timeline. How long will this take and when will the information be available?
and I'll have you guys add in. We should have all the focus groups completed by this spring, late winter, early spring. And we're targeting by this late summer to have kind of all of these results completed and culminated. And do you guys want to mention when we're doing some of the other focus groups?
So,
Yep, got 1 sec.
Well, we're still working on scheduling Tualatin River, and
what's that?
we're still working on scheduling our next one, but it shouldn't be too long here.
Yeah.
We have two schedules so far. One is November 4th and 5th in Loxahatchee, and what's the second one? Minnesota Valley.
Yeah, the next week is, I think it's
Minnesota
Minnesota.
Valley, right?
November 13th and 14th.
November 13th.
Minnesota Valley.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the third one as well, we have.
John Hines.
Yeah.
November 18th and 19th.
November 18th.
Oh, you can have a busy November.
Yeah.
So I was curious as to why you chose to focus just on wildlife-dependent activities and not just green space or open space activities as well.
We chose that. We had needed a place to start. Like we said, this is a first pass through the literature. And yeah, so giving us, we needed some kind of clearly defined boundaries to get a manageable number of papers for our first pass. It is something we expect to expand as we go through and go further.
Anything else? Well, let's give another round of applause for the panel. You did an excellent job.